Everyone, and welcome to the first mini lesson based on the historical overview. I have created a series of historical overview mini lessons when we jump in time in history. So sometimes there's certain presidents or events that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, but I think they're worth noting. So at the beginning of this school year, we started with looking at the foundational documents. So we looked at the Declaration of Independence, the preamble of the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, and the Reconstruction Amendments. This was all based off of the time period that you previously learned about in 8th grade humanities. However, now we're jumping forward, and there's roughly a 40-year gap where we're picking up around 1900 when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. In order to kind of fill that gap and talk about the presidents that don't always get a lot of recognition, I've created these assignments. The mini lessons are different because instead of taking your own notes, you are going to be filling in a graphic organizer, which is provided on Google Classroom, by filling in the blanks on the left hand side. So the graphic organizer is divided into two parts. On the left hand side, you will see that it's labeled at the top mini lesson notes. This takes the information off of the slides, because there's quite a bit of information off the slides, and creates blanks for some of the words. You are going to directly fill in the words that are listed in the mini lesson to fill in those blanks. After you complete the mini lesson notes portion of the graphic organizer, there are a series of additional videos and articles for you to explore to learn more about the presidents and the history in this time span we are jumping through between 1861 and 1900. So the purpose or the learning target for this lesson is I can summarize the major changes which happened in the country from the Civil War until 1900. So, in order to do this, I've organized it by the various presidents that held office in this time period. The first being Abraham Lincoln. So, we've already talked about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, obviously, is one of the most popular presidents. He was president during the Civil War. He gave the Emancipation Proclamation, which helped to kind of lead the way for ending slavery, while he had hoped that it would be an executive order that ultimately said that slavery no longer existed in the states that were no longer part of the Union. This was very hard to enforce, but it kind of paved the way for doing that. And he is also known for his assassination. So in 1865, before he's able to basically carry out his wishes in terms of getting the country back together in the Reconstruction era, he is assassinated. However, there are a lot of other things that happen in America during this time period that are not specifically focused on the Civil War. Some of that is related to legislation. So, Abraham Lincoln's administration passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which granted land to those willing to work it in order to promote agriculture in the West. So, this further expanded where people were living within the country and further expanded the agricultural industry. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 created a foundation of the Transcontinental Railway, which eventually connected the country from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. The Morrill Land Grants Act of 1862 provided grants for industrial and agricultural education. So we start to see a further support of expanding out to the western states, as well as a further expansion into the industries and especially agriculture. Just to give some background, not necessarily directly related to Lincoln, but during this time period, we start to see the development of a telegraph, which transformed how communications could be made during the war, made technology and communication a lot easier, and we see the expansion of the steam engine. In terms of culture, one of the biggest shifts we see is the abolition of slavery, which of course takes a long time for it really to work its way out. There was a span of time where a lot of slaves in the southern states did not even necessarily know they were free before everything had been communicated to the southern states, but the abolition of slavery is a huge step in the right direction. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson becomes president and serves until 1869. He is largely responsible for a huge chunk of history, collectively known as the Reconstruction era. The Reconstruction era represented a time when the country had to not only figure out how to rebuild the southern states, especially that had been destroyed during the war, but also figure out how to politically rebuild the country. Under Johnson's administration, we see the passage of the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery. We see the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which protects the free slaves. And we see the Tenure of Office Act, which limited the president's power to remove officials without Senate approval. Now, that one was not one that Johnson supported, and it was actually one that ended up getting him impeached because he did not follow the rule and the law that Congress had set forward, although he was never removed from office. In terms of technological advancements during this time period, we see further expansion of the railroad. In terms of culture, we see further conversation about freedom, citizenship, and individual rights, especially based around the right to vote. Jump forward to the next president, Ulysses S. Grant, served for 2 terms from 1869 until 1877. During this time period, we see the further development of Reconstruction. We also see the Panic of 1873, which represents an economic depression, which is highly characterized by unemployment and instability. During his presidency, we also see the passage of the 15th Amendment, which expands the right to vote to African American men. We also see the Enforcement Act of 1870, which is also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. It was aimed to combat violence and intimidation aimed at African Americans and especially kind of step out against the KKK. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 further protected access to public accommodations such as transportation and hotels to all citizens, including African Americans. During this time period, we see the development of the telephone, which further expands communication, and the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869. Rutherford Hayes serves from 1877 to 1881. During this time period, we see the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, which represented a break in basically the federal government trying to help the former enslaved individuals to ensure their freedom. We also see the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which represented a violent clash between state militias and federal troops over wage concerns and poor work conditions of railway workers. In terms of legislation, we see the Compromise of 1877, which is largely how Hayes was elected. He was handed the presidency in return for agreeing to remove federal troops from the South. It is debated whether he himself made that decision or people working for him did. The Resumption Act of 1875 created a gold standard starting in 1879, which further helped to support the economy to ensure that they couldn't just keep printing new money. This time period also sees the expansion into telecommunication and the creation of the telecommunication industry. In terms of culture, we start to see an increase in fight for labor rights, immigration, and we start to see the development of things like comedy shows and dime novels for entertainment. Fast forward to James Garfield. James Garfield had a very short presidency because he was assassinated on September 19th, 1881. He's one of the presidential assassinations that doesn't get a lot of recognition. During his time in office, he was a large part of creating the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which eventually was passed under Chester Arthur, which restricted the immigration of Chinese laborers to the United States. Chester Arthur served 1 term from 1881 to 1885. During that time, he passed the Tariff Act of 1883, which revised the tariff structure to protect American importation over that of what was being created in foreign countries. We also see the invention of the dishwasher, and we also see an increase in conflict between the U.S. government and Native American tribes, and a growing inequality from various social classes. Fast forward to Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He served from 1885 to 1889. 1889, he lost re-election, but ran for election in 1893 and served until 1897. During this time period, we see the Panic of 1893, which represented a failure of banks, unemployment, and the overbuilding of railroads that couldn't be paid for. We also see the Pullman strike of 1894, which was a nationwide railroad strike. In terms of legislation, we see the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we'll learn more about. This was passed in 1890 and was meant to curb monopolies and create fair competition in the economy. We also see the passage of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act of 1894, which reduced tariffs to lower consumer prices, so then people didn't have to pay as much whether the goods were imported from other countries or produced within the United States. In terms of technology, we start to see the development of electric streetcars in major cities across the country, as well as electricity in cities. And then to the last president that we're going to talk about today, Benjamin Harris. Benjamin Harris served from 1889 until 1893. During this time, we see the first Pan American Conference, which was a conference between various countries in the Northern America, Southern America, and Central American countries about common issues. In terms of legislation, we see the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which raised tariffs to support American industry. So again, we see this up, down in terms of tariffs. We also see the passage of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which was looking at ensuring that money was not getting printed unless it was silver-backed currency. We start to see the development of silent films in terms of entertainment. And we see an increase in consumerism, as well as the development of a movement known as the New Woman Movement, where women are starting to speak out about their rights, especially related to voting, education, and independence. So this is meant to fill that gap between 1861 and 1900. So we are going to pick up kind of after that point in looking at the NETS unit on the Industrial Revolution.